Welcome back to Invest Africa. The face of the African consumer is changing. The challenge for investors is to understand the market spectrum as well as to have the ability to cater for the basic consumer right through to the sophisticated and demanding high-end African consumer.
The African continent is geographically divided into 54 countries, of which 16 nations are landlocked, but the establishment of trade blocs such as the EAC, SADC and ECOWAS is making it easier to reach the goal of creating a single African market.
Africa is a continent with a bright future, and make sure that we can be able to grasp the opportunities and make sure that we can work together for united Africa, but also to consolidate and make sure that we can create better atmosphere for trading between ourselves.
At first glance, entering or expanding in Africa may appear daunting because of the undeniable complexity of the continent. Investors need to have an intimate understanding of the market that they're operating in, as consumer preferences and regulations vary from country to country. And getting this right is crucial to the survival of any business.
I think what you need to avoid, which I hear people do not want, they don't want to be treated like you are doing them a favor by coming and investing in our economy, and you want to try to bring your brand of what you think of as civilization into our economy. I think you are there to work and adapt your style to whatever the economy there is used to.
But an all-important question is, where should investors be putting their money?
The largest growing sector will be your retail sector, which fuels this or supports these street vendors who are at the bottom end of the income spectrum. You do have the professional ones who are educated. Those are buying more sophisticated goods. I think it's been said that a lot of people would sell a lot of things to Africa. People will just buy it. But I think the African consumer is becoming more sophisticated, particularly the educated middle class, which is emerging. Those are professionals who are going to be on Facebook, who are going to be on Twitter. We know, for instance, that the mobile industry is doing very, very well. I think they say over just around 500 million of African consumers have mobile phones. That opens up an avenue for retailers to sell goods to the African continent.
According to the Credit Issue 2011 Global Wealth Report, there are 71,000 dollar millionaires in South Africa alone, and this number is likely to climb to more than 240,000 over the next 5 years. The needs of this niche market must also be catered for. This dynamic market will not only be a source of generating opportunities for investors, but building dreams for Africa's youth. Dumisha Mahanyele, Johannesburg.
Still with me in studio, Martin Davis, the CEO of Frontier Advisory, Bill Rousseau, Director McKinsey & Company, David Cook, Director Access Africa Limited, and joining us now from our bureau in Lagos is Sili Egbe. He is the SS Consumer Analyst at CIB Research, Stanbic IB, TC Bank. Sili, thanks very much for joining us. And of course, we'd like to get your thoughts on the Nigerian consumer. What are we missing here in South Africa? What are the hot spots?
Well, we've obviously seen a very strong growth in consumer spending over the last decade, and our take is that you're going to continue to see that growth, over the next decade or two. What's interesting is that, the trends we've seen in Nigeria are actually no different from what we've seen in other parts of Africa, even South Africa inclusive. And we obviously believe that I think some of the key major issues you'd have going forward would be, the ability for, the government in the respective countries to sustainably, continue with ongoing economic reforms, because those have been, the key drivers of economic growth and consumer demand. As long as that continues and sustainable, I think that Africa would definitely be the next destination for consumer demand globally. I think there's a consensus that there is obviously the need for a new driver of consumer demand, and I think Africa could well be that driver.
Bill, I don't want to gloss over the cultural differences. We ended the last conversation with Dave giving his thoughts. I know you've done some research recently on whether the consumer differs radically across the African continent. Care to share?
Yeah, I think I agree with Dave that you do have to tailor by the local market. At the same time, though, we find some pretty big commonalities. Let me just mention a couple themes. One is young and optimistic. The second is a level of brand consciousness and love for quality. The third I would talk about is I call modern taste and sophistication. And then the rise of digital. If I go through those briefly, young and optimistic, 51% of consumers across the continent are under the age of 20. Under the age of 30 is 70%. So you have this enormous commonality in youth. We asked some questions around optimism. Strikingly, we found 84% of Africans believe they'll be better off in the next 2 years. That cuts across countries. Interestingly, if there's one big difference between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, this was it. The third thing that we found is that there is a high level of brand consciousness. More than 50% are actually loyal to one particular brand, 70% to just a few brands. There is some trading off when they go on deal and on promotion, but very brand conscious. At the same time, they really care about quality. Quality tends to be one of the top buying criteria. This was a big surprise for us. And then I think digital, lastly, is growing enormously. We found that 52 or 53% are online every month. 25% are online daily, most using mobile phones rather than
and digital perhaps speaks to distribution, which I know Dave is going to touch on in a moment. Martin, are people taking the trends in the social media platforms, your Twitters, your Facebooks, seriously when you are traveling across the African continent? Do you feel the momentum building?
I think certainly, but it comes down again to cultural, linguistic issues. I mean, again, on your map earlier of hotspots in Africa, there was not one country that is Francophone or French-speaking Africa. That's a population of 450 odd million people in the continent, and we haven't touched upon even one country that speaks French. So I mean, if we're increasingly looking at sort of African consumer spending, let's look beyond the obvious, the Kenyas, the South Africas, the Nigerias, and maybe a tag on as a Ghana. Let's look toward other parts of the continent. What's happening in Cote d'Ivoire? What's happening in Senegal? What's happening in sort of, that part of Africa? So I think, and that's a whole different language dynamic. Is Facebook, is Google available in French in that part of the continent? I certainly hope so. And that comes back to accessibility. What information are the young sort of consumers getting access to? I think, again, we must be careful of this demographic dividend. Yes, there's majority of people in Africa, the consumers, are young people under 20, as Bill said. But at the same time, is that this force of urbanization is very exciting. But the problem, I think, from a developmental perspective, yes, it's easy to sell stuff to young people, but from an urban management perspective, I think it's not sort of urbanization in some cases as it is slumization. And we see that across the continent. This, for me, is very much of a great, you mentioned social concern.
Distribution other than digital distribution, logistically, this must be a big challenge.
Well, it is, but I think it's also about mindset. So if you're a multinational company used to selling your consumer products through the formal retail channel, and you land in Lagos to somewhere like Balogun Market, that's a whole other world that you've got to get your distribution model mindset around. I think we talked about how the low level of formal retail penetration, and that's going to take a while. So to serve these consumers, this growing segment of the consumer population, well, you've got to understand and to be able to penetrate the informal markets. Now, there's some fantastic distribution businesses, local champions that have developed, but increasingly these are now looking at more regional-based distribution platforms. And those are the kind of things we get really excited about, where you can take a formal business platform that is really tapping into this informal cash-driven economy.
That sounds like a very good business model, and perhaps we need to have a whole show exactly on that distribution model. Isili, I'm taking it back to you in Lagos. If you were to set up a consumer-facing business after all of the research that you have done right now in West Africa, we gave you enough cash to do that, what would it be, sir?
At the moment, I'll focus on staple food producers. In there, I'm also referring to beer producers, and I think that it's one area that multinationals have been very quick to capitalize on. I mean, that industry today is, over close to about a $3 billion revenue generating industry, and represents quite a substantial profit pool, even within a global context. And so, as long as, with sort of the age the age bracket, in Nigeria, you have over 50%, slightly over 50% of the population within the bracket of about, say, 0 to about 30, 40 years old. And so they've been able to tap into that demographic and convert that into growth in beer volumes. We've seen beer volumes grow in excess of about 10% per annum over the last 10 years. And there's a likelihood that we continue to see sustained growth between, say, 8 to about 10%. Penetration in the sector is still relatively low. We're consuming roughly 11 liters per person at the moment, and that compares to a global average closer to about 35, 40 liters per person. So that is one sector that I think is quite important. I think a lot of the discretionary commodities are still a few years out from being, I think, immediate profit generators, substantially high profit generating businesses in the Nigerian market, and I believe that applies to also other African markets. There is a focus here on affordability and necessity. So it's important that, for you to be able to reach out substantially to the local consumer, your product is affordable and of great necessity.
Well, this is where we put ideas for our viewers and drill into your expertise. I'm going to ask you all exactly the same question. Dave, what business would you be setting up? Consumer facing, you've got the whole African continent to play with.
Oh, goodness. I think home and personal care products, branded packaged foods businesses, as consumers are starting to spend disposable income in those areas. We've just seen that rise through India, through Brazil, through the other emerging markets, and these are some of the common themes and trends we're talking about. What else? Quick service restaurants, again, challenging in some markets around real estate, but this is all about families going out and starting to spend those first extra dollars of consumer spend that they have available.
Great, good ideas being tabled. Martin, do you want to jump in?
Just to add to that, what about Yum Foods, McDonald's, where these food food chain restaurants, why aren't they expanding across the continent? We have very robust growth. For me, the macro picture is, and look at ShopRite, entered into India, frustrated by regulatory protectionism, complexity, and now perhaps greater thrust into Africa, where India is difficult, China is expensive, Africa's fragmented but open. And I think retail groups particularly are looking for growth, and they're certainly not coming from the developed world anytime soon.
Bill?
Yeah, I agree with Dave. The reality is we're looking at a $400 to $500 billion opportunity by the year 2020. Half of that is coming from food and non-food consumer goods. So I agree. Branded home and personal care and branded food products are going to soar.